is the final occasion for this year where we hear lectures and talks given by guests on Cold War themes, both within Canada and around the world. My name is Sean Campbell, and I am the curator here at the museum. So a bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you have any questions during the presentation, please pop them into the chat directly to Meetings Diefenbunker, and we will try to answer as many as we can following the presentation. We are meant to end at 1 p.m., but it is possible that the discussion will shift over that. We love to hear your thoughts. As well, for those present, as you saw, this session will be recorded for use on our social media channels. Our presentation this afternoon, our speakers this afternoon are Drs. Christabelle Sethna and Dr. Stephen Hewitt. Dr. Christabelle Sethna is a historian and full professor in the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies at the University of Ottawa, teaching courses on feminist methodologies, anti-racism, colonialism, and critical animal studies. She has published widely on sex education, contraception, and abortion transnational histories with focus on Canada. She is currently the principal investigator for a SSHRC-funded project about women's transnational travel for abortion services from the 1960s to the 1990s. Joining us from the UK, Dr. Stephen Hewitt is an associate professor in North American history at the University of Birmingham. He has written extensively on topics related to security and intelligence in the past and present. He is currently working on a history of terrorism and counterterrorism in Canada. Dr. Sethna and Hewitt are the co-authors of the 2018 book, Just Watch Us, RCMP Surveillance of the Women's Liberation Movement in Cold War Canada. The book shows how from the late 1960s to the mid-1980s, in the midst of the Cold War and second wave feminism, the RCMP Security Service, prompted by fears of left-wing and communist subversion, monitored and infiltrated the women's liberation movement in Canada and Quebec. It investigates why and how this movement was targeted, weighing carefully the presumed threat its left-wing ties presented to the Canadian government against the defiant challenge its campaign for gender equality posed to Canadian society. Their talk this afternoon, Spies, Lies, and Macho Guys, documenting RCMP surveillance against the women's liberation movement in Canada, will speak to their extensive work outlined in the book and how Cold War spying on individuals, groups, and activities considered subversive was widespread in Canada. As government surveillance efforts become more well known in the digital sphere and in the public discourse, it is an absolute pleasure to welcome today's discussion. I would now like to welcome Drs. Sethna and Hewitt for their presentation. Good afternoon to you both. The floor is yours.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much, Sean, for inviting us. And thank you all out there, wherever you are in cyber world, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. We're going to use a PowerPoint. Through the miracles of technology, we will both be speaking to the slides, but the slides are actually here with me in Birmingham. So fingers crossed, I'm going to start sharing my screen. This obviously is our title slide, playing upon some images associated with the RCMP and then images less well known about the RCMP. That's an actual RCMP surveillance photo from a bit earlier than the period we're looking at. That photo is from the early 1960s. It was actually an anti-nuclear demonstration on Parliament Hill, and that photo was snapped by a police informant who then took the negatives back to Quebec City, and they were obviously developed, and then they were used and labeled to identify the women that are in the photo. But we've got a little bit about our background. Christabelle?
Yes, so thank you, everyone. And I echo Steve's comments. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to present today. So Steve and I met a number of years ago at a conference in Sudbury, and eventually we decided to join forces because we each came upon declassified RCMP Security Service documents concerning the state surveillance of women's liberation groups in our own research projects. And so our first publication, it was on the abortion caravan. And this is a Canada-wide protest against the 1969 abortion law. We'll be talking about that later on in the presentation. And this first attempt at collaboration was published in 2009. And then the second piece that we worked on together was the 1971 Indo-Chinese conference, This was a large gathering of women against the Vietnam War held in Vancouver and in Toronto. And this was published in 2012. Since then, we have collaborated as well, notably in the book Just Watch Us. So these two events, the Abortion Caravan and the Indo-Chinese Conference, were the first major actions of the women's liberation movement, the sort of kickstart to second wave feminism. This is a period that coincided with the later Cold War and was profoundly influenced by anti-imperialism, the civil rights movement, the students' movement, the peace movement, the New Left, and opposition to the Vietnam War. So after the first two publications, McGill Queen's University Press approached us and asked us to publish a book. So we applied and received 3 years worth of funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and produced the book in 2018. And the book, like the two earlier publications, is based on thousands of pages of declassified RCMP Security Service documents and expands the work we did on the Abortion Caravan and the Indo-Chinese Conference. Over to you, Steve.
So Christabelle, as she mentioned, we met in 1996 in Sudbury, and both of us had been doing work kind of in this area for years before that, both in educational, Christabelle looking at high school students, me looking at universities. And so I think in terms of the sorts of documents that we used for this project that I'm about to talk about, I think I've had about 30 years now, probably tell by my gray hair, it's been a long time working with these documents. And the interesting things about, or the frustrating thing about using these records is that the fragmentary nature of these files. Now, I think we know from the ongoing court case surrounding former President Trump about the sensitivity around national security and around documents. But we're talking about documents that we have used for this project that are 50 years old, in some cases older. I mean, I've dealt with records that are 100 years old that are still being censored, not fully let out. And I should explain that we obtained the records through the Access to Information Act, which some of you may have heard of. It's obviously legislation that's been around now since the early 1980s. You apply for a particular file. The file is sometimes released, sometimes isn't released. It is often heavily redacted, issues around privacy, but usually issues around security. And the interesting thing is, so there are several 100,000 security records still held by the Library and Archives Canada that were at one time held by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police by its security branch, sometimes known as the Security Service. Even though those records are now held by Library and Archives Canada, if you make an access request, it's not Library and Archives Canada that decides what is removed and what isn't. It's actually the Canadian Security Intelligence Service that makes that decision, even though, as I said, these are historic records, in some cases going back decades, but because of the sensitive nature of the files, the redactions are made by CSIS. So that means for a project like this, sometimes you get considerable material, and sometimes, and this covers what I just mentioned, I should add as well that for those of you in Canada, the Globe and Mail has had an excellent series, I know, co-authored by Robin Doolittle, looking at access, looking at freedom of information at the federal level, but also at the provincial level, and how it's not fit for purpose, and it really is in sad need of reform. So when we put in a request, sometimes you get a bonanza, and sometimes you get files that look like this. So this is 3 pages of the same RCMP police report from April 25th, 1973, so over 50 years ago now, related to a group called La Ligue des Femmes du Québec, the Quebec Women's League, which was a fairly small left-wing group, communist-led in the province of Quebec. And so, you know, we get a file like this or a report like this, there's not a lot you can do with it. And this is another example from the same file, where you get a little more information. You can see names of some of the women who were involved in the Quebec Women's League. The bit deleted after the names is usually a file reference, which is the RCMP file reference, which is obviously the RCMP Security Service doesn't exist anymore, so it's not clear to me why their filing system would need still to be secret, given that CSIS, I'm sure, is not using the same filing system as the RCMP did 50 years ago. But what I'm going to do today, just to enlighten the presentation a little bit, is to kind of pull back the curtain and give you an insight on what sort of information, if we could see what was behind the redacted sections, what would be there. So here's the same report from 1973, and here are the pages without the redactions. And I should explain how this, a bit of feat of magic by me was done, or by us was done. And that was because we were sent two versions of the file. We were sent the redacted version, and we were also sent the unredacted version. And the interesting thing about what emerges in terms of the material that's held back, and I think we both found quite intriguing, is it's largely related to protecting sources. And I don't mean specific identities of sources, and by sources, I mean human informants, because those individuals are not, their names do not appear. Instead, it's codes that are put in. But I think it's as much about the future protection of sources, that intelligence agencies, when they recruit human intelligence, there's an expectation of this being kept secret. And so I think Canada is behind, for example, the US in terms of FBI records that are very similar to this, where the FBI has less reluctance in terms of putting out material. So this is a second example of where you can see the redacted and the unredacted. And this is a case where they list the source, and this is a code name. Would be a human source. MC76 would be someone within the organization that supplied a list of members. So there's considerable sensitivity around this material. As I said, there's no names listed in any sense, but if you do go through the files, you notice the same code names appear with certain individuals, and it gives you a pattern whereby either that individual is the code name source, or someone close to that individual is the code name source. Again, this is not obviously breaking any major national security insights by showing this. So, and just to give you an idea, again, the kind of what we're swimming against in terms of doing this sort of research. So the entire file, the uncensored file, was 513 pages. The censored file was 272 pages. So not quite, a little more than half of material, was available. And again, a lot of the material in a file is open source material, newspaper clippings, things like that. That isn't censored or redacted. It's the more sensitive security records where, and as I mentioned, it's almost always human sources that are involved. Back to you, Christabelle.
Okay, thank you. So when we first began working together, I speculated that the RCMP was spying on the women's liberation movement because of the abortion issue. At the time, it was the easiest go-to hypothesis that I could come up with. So why might this be the case? Well, the illegality of abortion at the time had given rise to clandestine abortion services. So illegal abortion providers, some of whom were qualified doctors, and pregnant women seeking abortion, and informal contacts, could be friends, could be family, helping pregnant women find abortion providers. All of these individuals feared police surveillance because they were technically participating in criminal activity. So eventually the government of Pierre Trudeau moved to liberalize the abortion law, and the passage of the new law in 1969 was supposed to alleviate the issue of illegal abortion, but it ended up legalizing abortion only under very restrictive circumstances. The law was based on approval for each abortion by a therapeutic by a hospital-based therapeutic abortion committee. And so this particular system to access legal abortion resulted in delays and arbitrary decision-making and a lot of inequality of access amongst women, particularly women who were single, who were poor, and who were racialized. So thus women continue to turn to illegal abortion providers to attempt to get a timely abortion, sparking a lot of anger at the needless suffering that women underwent. The inadequacies of the new law galvanized the fledgling women's liberation movement to insist on abortion law repeal, and there were many early women's liberation organizations that became involved in abortion referral services. So leading the way was the Vancouver Women's Caucus, which planned to journey from Vancouver to Ottawa in a cavalcade of automobiles to protest the new law. However, the declassified documents, as we did a deeper dive into these documents, indicated that the RCMP Security Service was far more interested in connections women's liberation groups might have to old and new left organizations than in any possible abortion law breaking. So back to you, Steve. Steve, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. So our argument evolved in the book, and I think it was in keeping with the sort of history of Canadian state security, really that goes back to World War I and the Russian Revolution, and that was the rise of the far left, and that is seen as the main security threat, domestic security threat for several decades. There is some attention at times to the extreme right, spying on the Klan, for example, in the 1920s, but the main focus is on communism, the Communist Party of Canada, and this is true through to the 1960s. And then something happens that Christabelle already alluded to, and that is that the left begins to fracture. You have the rise of something called the New Left, that is sort of criticizes not only capitalism, but also criticizes old-style communism, Stalinism, things such as that. And so suddenly the world of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police becomes a little more complex in terms of what they're looking at. You also have the rise of the anti-war movement, you have the Black Power movement, you have Red Power movement, and then you have the women's liberation movement. And so the RCMP is looking at these various movements, but still trying to understand them in relation to the left. So, for example, even Quebec nationalism, when it becomes, elements of it become violent in the early 1960s through the FLQ, even that the RCMP at times is trying to understand through the prism of communism. Everything, because of these decades of this is the main security threat, the reaction to these new threats is through a similar sort of worldview, similar sort of framework. Now, eventually, RCMP does come to recognize that the new left is not the same as the old left, but they see the new left is using effectively the same tactics of the old left through front organizations. So we're talking Maoist groups, we're talking Trotskyist groups, we're talking other groups on the left, and that they're exploiting some of these movements, women's liberation, Black Power, things such as that. And I think the key word here, and it's a word that isn't used anymore, but it's really important to understanding Cold War history of security. So after the end of the Cold War, and sort of in popular culture now, the focus is on espionage. That, you know, if you think of the TV series The Americans, Bridge of Spies, the Spielberg film, it's all around Soviet espionage. But at least in terms of what the RCMP was doing, there was much focus on what was called subversion. This was the idea of left-wing groups with possible connections to the Soviet Union or other foreign interests infiltrating into Canadian institutions and influencing public policy. Women were seen as vulnerable because of sort of gender stereotypes of the time. Students were seen as vulnerable because they were young and impressionable. Sometimes, obviously, there's overlap between students being female. And so subversion is this kind of key element. as a justification for the police spying on women's group. And it's interesting, I think the word subversion isn't used now in 2023, but there is overlap with what today is called foreign interference. You've had obviously lots of discussion in Canada around Chinese foreign interference, around Russian foreign interference. And I think if we were 50 years ago, foreign interference could probably be labeled as subversion. So in terms of how the RCMP carried out its surveillance, there's obviously the Hollywood version that we're all familiar with. Again, a movie like Enemy of the State with lots of really cool technology and spy satellites and things such as that. And then there's the Canadian reality. And this is a cartoon that actually appeared in a Quebec newspaper in response to the revelations in our research, which was that the RCMP had infiltrated the women's movement. And it's obviously playing upon undercover Mountie, hanging out with feminists. The reality was that the police spied used three main methods in terms of accumulating intelligence on the women's movement. One was open source intelligence. I mentioned already newspaper clippings. The police were pack rats. They would go through newspapers. They would go through magazines like Georgia Straight and any other sort of publications. They would pick up flyers at public events. So there was open source material. Then there was the surveillance by the police themselves at rallies, at events that were open to anyone, where the police would go undercover to attend speeches and take notes and things such as that. And then, and this I think is perhaps the most troublesome part of what our story is today that we're talking about, is what about all female gatherings? So the amount of police at this time was a completely male organization up until about, I think, 1974. So before 1974, there weren't female Mounties that could go into all female gatherings. So the reality is the police relied on women to spy on other women. They recruited women already in some of these organizations, or they found women outside these organizations who were willing to infiltrate them for ideological reasons, for pay, for the excitement of the power of knowing secrets and things such as that. So I think this is a troubling aspect of this research. And this is one of the things that came out in those earlier documents, the uncensored version, how riddled that small women's group in Quebec was with informants. It was something like 30 different code names for that small group. And so the reality is that women were spying on women. Christabelle?
Yes, thank you. So we learned that the RCMP Security Service was spying on the Vancouver Women's Caucus, and then later the abortion caravan as it made its way to Ottawa, using informants, caucus material, the mainstream press, and the alternative press. So as an example, and I don't know how well you can see this on your screens, but as an example, we found an editorial cartoon from the Georgia Straight being a radical Vancouver newspaper. And this cartoon was placed on file, and it portrays the plight of a poor single mother facing an all-male therapeutic abortion committee that rejects her request for an abortion only to have her commit suicide. So you can see that in the two panels. I don't know how clearly. And so the cartoon reflects the preoccupations of the women's liberation movement with the difficulties facing marginalized women seeking legal pregnancy termination in Canada. But the RCMP Security Service continued to look for evidence of subversion, sometimes using, as Steve just said, informants who were women. So in the larger gatherings when there were women and men present, the informant obviously could be male, but in the closed door meetings, the informants would have to be women. And sometimes we found minutes of meetings. So that was particularly interesting because some of those meetings would have been closed door meetings of women's liberation groups. We also found in the files, and I remember, I'm sure Steve shares this memory, I remember being at a very large table in Steve's office at the University of Birmingham and sort of checking in with each other every now and then about the documents that we were reading. I was just astonished at how close the surveillance was. And then sometimes in the documents, we found commentary from the informant or the person who was reading the reports that the informant was submitting, comments that were quite derogatory to the women, and especially derogatory to their appearance. If they were dressed like hippies, that was a prejudice at the time, or they somehow appeared unfeminine. Now, despite the long stretch of surveillance against the Vancouver Women's Caucus and the abortion caravan, when the caravan arrived in Ottawa on Mother's Day in 1970, the police officers on the ground were caught unawares. What you're also seeing in this slide are photographs, and these are archival photographs. So photographs of the lead van that led the abortion caravan, and you can see it says abortion is our right, and then a smaller letter, smash capitalism. And you can also see another slide of women holding hands in a circle surrounding the van as it made its way across the country. But when the abortion caravan arrived in Ottawa on Mother's Day, the police officers on the ground were caught unawares. In one instance, a group of protesters, angry that no high-ranking politician would meet with them, as the Vancouver Women's Caucus had demanded publicly, they broke off from the main demonstration and headed for the Prime Minister's residence. And the protesters were able to get past the few guards stationed at 24 Sussex Drive and sat down on the Prime Minister's lawn. And 2 days later, there was a second security breach, this time at the House of Commons. Approximately 25 caravanners who deliberately dressed themselves very decorously, entered the public galleries and chained themselves to their seats. And at 3 p.m. at the appointed hour, they shouted their opposition to the abortion law, setting off pandemonium that shut down the House of Commons for the first time in its history. And security guards eventually unchained the women, and outside they joined another contingent of protesters and burned a copy of the abortion law. And this mirrors some of the burning of draft cards that we see among American males who refuse to participate in the Vietnam War. And I want to say here at this point that if you want to read further about this, Dr. Shannon Sethna has done a marvelous job of looking at the relationship between the abortion caravan against the backdrop of the Vietnam War. So it's likely that the RCMP did not take the women seriously and underestimated their intentions. One of their intentions publicly stated was that they wanted women to make war on the government because of this very egregious 1969 abortion law. So gendered expectations, the youth of the women, their class position, their whiteness, all had a role to play. Okay, so back to you, Steve.
Thanks. Just to add to that final point, I think how we found gender impacted in terms of this topic was not that the police spied on the women in the first place, primarily because of gender, but rather how they interpreted the women's actions, and gender came into play, as Christabelle mentioned, in terms of that protest in Ottawa in 1970, and also some of the tactics obviously used in terms of using women to spy on women. So the other major event from the early 1970s is what's known as the Indo-Chinese Conference that took place, first one in Vancouver and then one in Toronto. This involved a group of women coming over from Indochina, from Vietnam, I think Laos as well, and participating with not only Canadian women, but American women as well. Canada was picked because it was felt because Canada was not directly at war that the women would be able to be allowed into the country, which they were. But of course, Canada was also seen by many as being complicit in the Vietnam War in terms of industries that were connected to the conflict, in terms of other support for the United States. So there were certainly, obviously, there was a strong anti-war movement in Canada. There were many Americans who had come as war resistors to avoid going to fight in Vietnam, came with their families in the tens of thousands. There were regular protests around the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. Consulate in Toronto and things such as that. So Canada was seen as complicit in the American war machine and a legitimate target for not only protests, but also potentially for trying to influence government policy around the war in Vietnam. So these events take place in Vancouver and Toronto. The Vancouver one is really interesting because, and I say it's interesting because we have a lot more in the way of police records around Vancouver. And I think we've speculated that the Toronto event, which happens after, the security was much tighter and there was less opportunity for police informants and others to infiltrate the meeting. So again, it's a group of women from Canada and the US. There are generational differences. So there's the Voice of Women, an older peace movement made of women who are present. And then there's younger New Left women who are there as well. And then there's a group called Third World Women that are there. From the United States. There are queer women that are there as well. And so at times these tensions emerge, which is really interesting in terms of what's happening with the women's movement in the 1970s. There's tensions along racial lines. There's tensions around sexuality. There are generational tensions between the older peace activists and younger feminists. It's really interesting. Christabelle mentioned that some of the reports that that this is coming from the informants, they're often scathing about the way the women are dressed, about their sexuality. And it's not hard to, when you read that, to kind of imagine that this is possibly an informant who's an older woman and is sort of reacting quite negatively. The use of drugs, for example, smoking weed is mentioned in the reports. So there's all kinds of sort of tensions that emerge, including between Canadian and American women as well, that some of the Canadian women react quite negatively. They feel like the Americans are sort of taking over or acting as if they're in the United States when they're in Canada. And then the Toronto meeting happens after that, again, with the same Indo-Chinese women and similar sorts of dynamics going on, but we have less in the way of police records around that second meeting, which speaks to the need, obviously, at times to broaden the sources that are used. Back to you, Christabelle.
Okay, thank you. So when we did this work on the book, we decided that we would stick to the documents and do a close reading of the documents. And we spoke to very few women from that era. And now that the book has been published, we're really interested in doing some interviews, particularly around this Indo-Chinese conference. And because of the differences that we detected in the documents between the Vancouver leg of the conference and the Toronto leg, as Steve said, we found very little information about the Toronto leg, but it was clear that through informants, and the informants also amassed an enormous range of published material that was distributed at the conference. So because of all of this material, the appended material, and then the Security Service documents for the Vancouver conference, we had a lot to work with. And it was clear that the informant or informants who were present had a front seat facing all of these tensions. So we ended up interviewing post-book in 1921 and 1922, a total of 6 women. 3 participated in the Toronto leg and 3 in the Vancouver leg of the conference. And I invited them to this talk, and I hope they're all here. So it was really a privilege to interview the 6 of them. And the interview data from the Vancouver women confirm what the documents were telling us about the splits and difficulties amongst the women attending the conference, but also provided a more nuanced look behind the scenes. The Vancouver interviewees, who were members of the Vancouver Women's Caucus, reported being overwhelmed by the logistics of planning such a large international conference, but were thrilled to welcome the Indo-Chinese women. The interview data from the Toronto women helped us to understand why the declassified documents did not contain much information about Toronto. So in general, the interviewees reported that their strong anti-imperialist stance and the example of the abortion caravan motivated them to become involved with the Indo-Chinese conference. Securing the safety of the Indo-Chinese women and the other conference participants was paramount. The interviewees were all aware of the history of McCarthyism, Canada's complicity in the Vietnam War, and this is a real sticking point, the sort of Canada's supposed neutrality in public, but its complicity in the background. The actions of they were aware of the actions of the FBI against racialized activists in the USA. Of course, there was the presence of American draft resistors and their families in Canada, and also the imposition of the War Measures Act in Quebec. So altogether, this constituted a really challenging security landscape that the women had to navigate in the Vancouver leg and in the Toronto leg. So thus they suspected that they would be spied upon due to their involvement in the Indo-Chinese conference. The declassified documents reveal that there was an informant or informants present at the Vancouver leg of the conference. Now, it's possible that because the Vancouver leg of the conference occurred before the Toronto leg, surveillance resources had already been spent. However, as Steve mentioned, the Toronto interviewees indicate that the conference security system that they put in place may have helped to weed out some of the informants. So the Toronto leg required participants to pre-register and be vetted. And there was security at the entrances and exits of the school building in which the conference was held. Security included frisking and, in a pre-cell phone era, yelling out to others if any problems were encountered. So the team would then move toward the problem area. So in one instance, we were told that when some unwelcome visitors rushed the school entrance, male comrades from the USA who accompanied the American women to the conference armed themselves with mops and brooms, ready to act if needed. And in another case, an adult male who looked suspiciously like an operative was denied entry to the building. And all the interviewees understood pragmatically that informants would likely be women under these circumstances and held no illusions. Informants were usually close to the surveillance target, and there were already informants embedded against organizations like the Black Panthers and also civil rights groups. And there was an assumption on the part of some of the interviewees that women could be hostile or competitive with each other. And this was the kind of ethos that would have been encouraged in their day. Okay, back to you, Steve.
And what Christabelle's just identified is what we come to conclude in the book is some of the limitations around a reliance on police documents. And the limitation is not just simply in terms of the actual surveillance reports, but also some of the open source material. And we're speaking now directly about some of the material that was produced by some of the groups that the police were spying on. The fact that informants or undercover police officers at times were involved in some of these groups. There are other examples of this outside of the topic we're looking at. There's a famous case of a group called London Greenpeace here in the UK, where there was a big lawsuit between McDonald's and this group over material put out, and it later emerged that an undercover police officer had written some of the material. So it raises the prospect of the unreliable narrator, taking us back, and spoiler alert, to a certain Agatha Christie novel, some of you might be familiar with. And so it made us really reflect, I think, the writing of this book on the nature of these documents, on their limitations, and even things that were uncensored, these open source material coming from the groups themselves. The fact that these groups might often have had informants who sometimes were even maybe in leadership roles brings into question then the nature of the documents and requires a kind of extra level of scrutiny and skepticism when it comes to material. Christabelle?
Okay. Would you like me to move toward the conclusion?
We can go to the conclusion. I think we have our concluding slide, but did you want to mention at all about the ethical issue or not? Or should we save that for the Q&A?
Can we save that for the Q&A?
Sure.
Yes. Okay. So one of the things that we found was that working with declassified documents was challenging, was much more challenging than originally anticipated due to their fragmented nature. And the deep cuts to the material meant that we saw only a partial picture. Questions about the origins of the documents and the role of the informants in producing the documents added another layer of concern. So too did decisions we had to make about how to treat the sensitive material that remained visible. For example, the unkind comments in the documents about women's physical appearance, or casual observations that reveal potentially embarrassing information about individuals decades later. So for these reasons, we suggest that those working with declassified documents consider very carefully about how to balance censorship against profound questions of privacy and ethics. This is an area that Steve and I ourselves, we talk about this in the book, about our sort of disagreement when we were researching and writing the book. And we can speak more about that during the question and answer session, but that's it for me. Steve?
That's all I have. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sethna and Hewitt, for your presentation on this very fascinating topic. Coming into this, my initial understanding of state surveillance, was the classic thing with regards to the Cold War was what the FBI was up to, what MI5 was up to during that period of time. But I never came across anything that really delved into what the RCMP or within Canada, what was going on. So I really appreciate that you both created this very informative book that really dives into the documents themselves. It was very eye-opening. To prepare for this, I was trying to find elements to tie back to the themes, and one of the things that came to me is that I remember seeing that the monk debates that happen in Toronto annually on certain topics. I revisited the 2014 one in which they discussed the validity, whether there was validity to state surveillance, and I remember one of the people opposing the motion with regards to the validity of state surveillance was Glenn Greenwald. And I know you mentioned him at the beginning of your book. And he had this quote that stuck with me as I was, as we were about to come into this, which basically said, as human beings, we all understand that privacy is a unique guarantee of human freedom. It's where creativity, dissent, and exploration reside. And when that is gone, so too is a crucial part of human freedom. And I was really thinking about that as we were coming into this and discussion. And then I was also thinking about how to tie it back to today about the ideas of, there's the issue of state surveillance, but what is that now in terms of surveillance capitalism as another element in people's experience with society, between the two of them. And then another, just a final point in terms of an inspiration that came from this. Now, after rereading the book, I want to go now and I want to investigate. We actually have a section in our Canada and the Cold War display that talks about Operation Profunk. So I'm really interested now in going back and revisiting those. So a reminder for those who have entered the talk late, you can enter your questions to Meetings Diefenbunker in the chat to ask our presenters a question. I have a few thoughts I just wanted to bring up before we introduce questions from the audience. So, informed by your research, what are trends that you're noticing today in Canada with regards to surveillance that you think the public should know about and be more informed on?
You want to go first, Steve?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there's obviously a lot more awareness, perhaps now, around state surveillance. I mean, I think your question about, or your situating this in relation to surveillance capitalism versus state surveillance, I think is a really interesting one. And I was reflecting upon this and thinking about this, that I, as a sort of middle-aged heterosexual white male, I am certainly subject, I think, to surveillance capitalism. And anyone who's online who does anything, I've targeted Facebook ads, things such as that. But I think the society we live in, and I think this is how things haven't changed that much, those that are somehow marginalized through the mainstream or by the state because of religion, because of sexuality, because of gender, because of age, for whatever reason, still can come and be on the receiving end of state surveillance. And I think the difference between now and then is laws and other things have been passed to make much of what at one time, in terms of what the RCMP did in the 1970s around dirty tricks in Quebec, disruption operations, things such as that. A lot of those things are now legal to be carried out. And so I think the state has a good power to itself, certainly more scrutiny, thanks to the internet and increased privacy in some ways. But I think the state also has more power, in a sense, over everyone's lives than perhaps they did 50 years ago. Christabelle?
Yeah, thank you. I just think it's very interesting, a kind of a split that I'm observing. And on the one hand, there seem to be people. Can you hear me? Yes, there seem to be people who are very willingly participating in surveillance capitalism with numerous platforms that they're on. And then on the other hand, there seem to be large numbers of people who are participating in conspiracy theories about, the way the government is surveilling every aspect of their lives. And so on the one hand, people are giving up their privacy. On the other hand, there's a contingent of people who participate in conspiracy theories about how the government is responsible for spying on them, while they're using the same technological devices that are employed to spy upon them for purposes of capitalism. So I think that is a very interesting trend. I also think that we should never be we should be cautious about the real impact of state surveillance on individual people's lives, and the way in which individual people's lives and their families' lives can absolutely be ruined. One of the major deficits of the work that we were doing was very much about the censorship. So there's a lot that we don't know, that we couldn't know. So just going back to the book, there was a kind of a post-mortem about the security breaches that were occurring after the abortion, the caravan, and particularly the women heading into the House of Commons. So there was understandable fear at the time of, what could an invader do when these young women ended up invading the House of Commons and sort of tricking the guards. We don't have access to that postmortem because it was completely censored. So we don't know what steps may have been taken afterward in terms of state surveillance. So I remain suspicious about the power of state surveillance to ruin individual people's lives. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. I think we can jump now. We've had quite a few comments coming into the meeting chat. I'll start off with the first one from Drew LeBlanc. He just wants